When the guns fell silent in August 1945, the United States Navy possessed the most powerful battleship fleet the world had ever seen. 23 battleships had survived the war, massive steel fortresses that had bombarded enemy shores from the Pacific to the Mediterranean. But within just a few years, almost all of them would vanish from active service. What really happened to these titans of the sea? The answer is far more complex and fascinating than you might imagine. The end of World War II marked a pivotal moment in naval warfare. The aircraft carrier had proven itself as the new queen of the seas, and the atomic bomb had changed the calculus of warfare forever. But America's battleships didn't simply sail off into the sunset. Their fate would be determined by Cold War politics, technological advancement, budget constraints, and a few surprising returns to service that nobody expected. Let's start with the immediate aftermath of the war. In 1945, the U.S. Navy had 4 Iowa-class battleships, 2 South Dakota-class, 4 North Carolina-class, 12 older standard-type battleships, and the unique USS Texas. These ships represented different eras of naval design, from World War I veterans to the most modern fast battleships ever built. The question facing naval planners was simple but brutal. What do we do with them? The first wave of decommissioning came swiftly. By 1947, just 2 years after the war ended, the process had already begun. The older battleships were the first to go. Ships like USS Arkansas, USS New York, and USS Nevada had seen hard service. But their fate wasn't a quiet retirement. The Navy had a rather explosive use for them. Operation Crossroads, the atomic bomb tests at Bikini Atoll in July 1946, needed target ships. USS Nevada, the proud survivor of Pearl Harbor, was positioned as a target for the Able test. The bomb missed her by over half a mile, and Nevada survived the blast. She also survived the underwater Baker test the following month, though heavily contaminated with radiation. The Old Warrior was finally sunk by naval gunfire and torpedoes in July 1948, taking 4 days to sink. She went down, fighting to the very end. USS Arkansas and USS New York met similar fates at Bikini. Arkansas was directly beneath the Baker underwater detonation and was instantly destroyed, her hull crushed by the immense pressure wave. New York survived both blasts, but was scuttled due to radiation contamination. These weren't just tests of nuclear weapons. They were symbolic executions of the battleship era itself, demonstrations that atomic power had rendered these great ships obsolete. USS Pennsylvania, another Pearl Harbor survivor, was also too radioactive after the Bikini tests and was scuttled in 1948. The irony wasn't lost on naval historians. Ships that had survived surprise attack, kamikaze strikes, and years of combat were ultimately destroyed by the very weapons that were supposed to make all conventional warfare obsolete. But not all battleships met such dramatic ends. The Great Depression and World War II era ships began entering reserve status. The mothball fleet concept was born from the reality that America might need these ships again. The 4 Iowa-class battleships, USS Iowa, USS New Jersey, USS Missouri, and USS Wisconsin, were too new and too capable to simply discard. By 1949, 3 of them were in reserve. USS Missouri remained in active service longer, having earned fame as the site of Japan's surrender ceremony. The 12 standard-type battleships, veterans of World War I that had been modernized before or during World War II, faced a less certain future. Ships like USS Tennessee, USS California, USS Maryland, and USS Colorado had provided crucial fire support during Pacific amphibious operations. Their heavy guns could deliver devastating bombardment, but they were slow, crew-intensive, and expensive to operate. By 1947, most were decommissioned and placed in reserve. Here's where the story takes its first unexpected turn. The Korean War broke out in June 1950, and suddenly, the Navy needed those big guns again. The mountainous Korean terrain and the close proximity of targets to the coastline made naval gunfire support invaluable. USS Missouri was rushed back from her Mediterranean cruise. She spent over 200 days on the firing line, her 16-inch guns demolishing North Korean positions. She was joined by older battleships pulled from mothballs. USS New Jersey was recommissioned in November 1950, and USS Wisconsin followed in March 1951. Even USS Iowa returned to service in August 1951. These 4 Iowa-class battleships provided critical fire support throughout the Korean War. A single 16-inch shell could destroy a hardened bunker, collapse a tunnel system, or obliterate a supply depot. The battleships could stay on station for days, firing hundreds of rounds. No aircraft of the era could provide that kind of sustained, heavy bombardment. The Korean War proved something important. Battleships weren't obsolete in every scenario. For shore bombardment and fire support, they were still unmatched. But this renaissance would be brief. When the Korean War armistice was signed in 1953, the battleships quickly returned to reserve status. USS Missouri was decommissioned in February 1955. USS New Jersey followed in August 1957. USS Iowa and USS Wisconsin were laid up in 1958. Now the older battleships were being scrapped. USS Idaho went to the breakers in 1947. USS Mississippi served briefly as a gunnery test ship before being scrapped in 1956. USS New Mexico, USS Tennessee, USS California, and others were all cut up for scrap metal through the 1950s and early 1960s. These proud warriors that had survived Pearl Harbor, the battles of the Pacific, and kamikaze attacks were reduced to razor blades and steel beams. But 2 battleships avoided this fate through sheer historical significance. USS Texas, commissioned in 1914, had served in both World Wars. She was the first U.S. battleship to become a museum ship, preserved in Houston in 1948. She remains there today, the only surviving dreadnought battleship that served in both World Wars. USS North Carolina was saved by the citizens of North Carolina through a fundraising campaign and became a museum ship in Wilmington in 1961. She had nearly been sold for scrap. USS Massachusetts became a museum in Fall River, Massachusetts in 1965. USS Alabama was preserved in Mobile Bay in 1964. These museum ships represented a growing recognition that battleships were historically significant, symbols of American power and sacrifice. But they were still viewed as relics of a bygone era. The 1960s brought another surprise. The Vietnam War created a new demand for naval gunfire support. In 1967, USS New Jersey was pulled from mothballs once again. She was modernized with updated electronics and communications equipment and arrived off Vietnam in September 1968. For nearly 7 months, she pounded Viet Cong and North Vietnamese positions. Her 16-inch guns could reach targets over 20 miles inland, well beyond the range of any artillery the enemy possessed. New Jersey fired nearly 6,000 rounds of 16-inch ammunition during her Vietnam deployment. Her shells destroyed bunkers, gun positions, and supply routes in missions that would have required multiple airstrikes. She was cost-effective and terrifying to the enemy. But she was also alone. No other battleship was recommissioned for Vietnam. The Navy was focused on carriers and guided missile ships. USS New Jersey returned to reserve status in December 1969. This should have been the end of the battleship story. By 1970, only the 4 Iowa-class ships remained in reserve. Everything else had been scrapped or turned into museums. The Navy had moved on to guided missile cruisers and nuclear-powered carriers. The battleship seemed destined to fade into history. Then came the Reagan administration and the 600-ship Navy plan. In the 1980s, the Cold War was intensifying. The Soviet Navy was expanding rapidly, and the U.S. Navy needed to counter this threat. Defense Secretary John Lehman championed a plan to reactivate the Iowa-class battleships and modernize them with cutting-edge technology. This was controversial. Critics argued that battleships were obsolete, too expensive, and vulnerable to modern anti-ship missiles. But Lehman prevailed. USS New Jersey was recommissioned in December 1982, followed by USS Iowa in April 1984, USS Missouri in May 1986, and USS Wisconsin in October 1988. These weren't the same battleships that fought in World War II. They were transformed into modern warships. 32 Tomahawk cruise missiles were installed in armored box launchers. 16 Harpoon anti-ship missiles gave them long-range striking power. Phalanx close-in weapon systems provided defense against missiles and aircraft. Modern radar, communications, and electronic warfare systems were integrated. The reactivated battleships could launch Tomahawk missiles at targets hundreds of miles away, then close to provide devastating naval gunfire support. They carried remotely piloted vehicles for targeting and reconnaissance. They were command ships, fire support ships, and powerful symbols of American naval might. Critics pointed out that these modernizations cost over $500 million per ship, enough to build several modern frigates. USS New Jersey deployed to Lebanon in 1983 during the Lebanese Civil War. She fired her 16-inch guns in anger for the first time since Vietnam, bombarding Syrian and Druze militia positions in the mountains overlooking Beirut. The psychological impact was enormous. Each shell weighed as much as a car and created a blast visible from miles away. USS Missouri and USS Wisconsin both served in Operation Desert Storm in 1991. Missouri fired Tomahawk missiles at targets in Iraq on the first night of the war, then moved close to the Kuwaiti coast to bombard Iraqi positions. Wisconsin also launched Tomahawks and provided gunfire support. Their remotely piloted vehicles conducted reconnaissance missions. At one point, an Iraqi shore battery fired on Wisconsin's RPV. Wisconsin's response was to obliterate the battery with 16-inch shells. It was the last time a battleship fired in anger. But this final hurrah was brief. The end of the Cold War and budget pressures made the battleships too expensive to maintain. They required massive crews, over 1,500 sailors per ship. They consumed enormous amounts of fuel. Spare parts were difficult to obtain. The Navy needed to invest in submarines, carriers, and Aegis cruisers. USS Iowa was decommissioned in October 1990. USS New Jersey followed in February 1991. USS Missouri served until March 1992, exactly 50 years after she was commissioned. USS Wisconsin was the last, decommissioned in September 1991. This time it really was the end. Congress mandated that the Iowa-class ships be maintained in a state that would allow reactivation. But this requirement was lifted in 2006. All 4 ships were stricken from the Naval Vessel Register and designated as museum ships. USS Iowa is now a museum in Los Angeles. USS New Jersey is preserved in Camden, New Jersey, across from Philadelphia. USS Missouri sits in Pearl Harbor, moored near the USS Arizona Memorial. USS Wisconsin is a museum in Norfolk, Virginia. The last operational American battleship fired its guns in combat in February 1991. No battleship will ever serve in the U.S. Navy again. The Naval Surface Fire Support mission has been taken over by guided missile destroyers and cruisers firing Tomahawk missiles and naval artillery. Plans for new battleships or large gun-armed ships have been proposed and rejected repeatedly. What happened to America's battleships after World War II is a story of technological change, strategic evolution, and unexpected resurrections. Ships that were supposed to be obsolete in 1946 ended up fighting in 4 different wars over 4 different decades. They survived because they could do things that no other weapon system could match. Their heavy guns provided fire support that was immediate, sustained, and devastating. But they also died because they represented an older form of warfare. They were expensive, crew-intensive, and vulnerable. Modern missiles could strike targets with precision from hundreds of miles away. Carriers could project power across entire oceans. Submarines could lurk unseen and strike without warning. The battleship's combination of armor, guns, and presence no longer fit the Navy's needs. The 8 surviving American battleships that are now museums represent one of the most successful naval preservation efforts in history. Millions of people have walked their decks, touched their guns, and learned their stories. They are tangible connections to World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and the Cold War. The fate of America's battleships teaches us about how military technology evolves, how strategic thinking changes, and how institutions struggle to let go of capabilities that once defined them. The battleship era lasted barely 40 years at its peak, from the dreadnought revolution around 1906 to the dominance of carriers by 1945. But battleships themselves served for 80 years total, from USS Texas in World War I to USS Wisconsin in Desert Storm. What really happened to America's battleships after World War II is that they refused to die quietly. They kept coming back, proving their worth in limited conflicts where their unique capabilities were needed. They survived atomic tests, Cold War budget cuts, and institutional bias against them. In the end, they were retired not because they couldn't fight, but because the Navy evolved beyond them. Today, no nation operates battleships. The last battleship in service anywhere was HMS Vanguard, retired by the Royal Navy in 1960. Russia's Kirov-class battlecruisers are sometimes called battleships, but they're really large guided missile cruisers. The age of the battleship is definitively over. But the legacy remains. The Iowa-class ships in particular remain iconic. Proposals to reactivate them surface occasionally, usually dismissed as impractical. Modern naval artillery systems, railguns, and precision-guided munitions are being developed to provide some of the capabilities battleships once offered, but on smaller, more efficient platforms. The story of America's battleships after World War II is ultimately a story about adaptation and obsolescence, about how even the mightiest weapons can be surpassed, but also about how useful capabilities can persist far longer than anyone expects. These steel giants didn't fade away immediately. They fought, they adapted, they returned from retirement multiple times, and finally, they found honor in preservation rather than the scrapyard. From Operation Crossroads to Desert Storm, from mothballs to modernization, America's battleships lived far more complex and interesting lives after World War II than during the war itself. Their story is the Navy's story, the story of American power projection, and a reminder that in military affairs, nothing is truly permanent except change itself.